Hi everyone, welcome to week 3. This is the week 3 lecture for Story and Audience. I hope you've been enjoying the course so far, getting a little bit out of things, enjoying the workshops and getting a bit more of a sense of what we'll be doing, particularly for assignment 1. And this lecture has a lot to do with what you'll be exploring for assignment 1, but also just in general about the course and getting to know your tutor and each other a little bit better. So without further ado, this is what we'll be looking at today. So we'll be getting into a little bit more of what being a fan is about, first of all. So that kind of personal experience of acting out or performing a fandom, being part of a fan community. But also observing fans and fandoms and this idea of fan groups and fans themselves as objects of interest and areas of study for scholars like us and like you and anyone who's kind of interested in stories and how people engage with them. So with that in mind, this is the plan for today. We'll talk a little bit about how to approach fans, not like on the street or anything, but just how to start thinking about them. We'll look a little bit at the history of fan studies as an area of study, a discipline. We'll look at the intersection between fan practices and media forms and formats. We'll talk a little bit about fan communities and cultural production. We'll look a little bit at autoethnography, what that means, and kind of how to start going about it. It's the main method that you'll be using for assignment 1, and then we'll finish off with where to from here, as we normally do. So, stories are always told by someone, and as long as there have been storytellers, those storytellers have had their followers. But fandoms, I guess, in their current form, were only really recognised as a phenomenon in the mid part and maybe sort of the second half of the 20th century. For those of you who have done the reading, I did just want to play the sketch that Henry Jenkins wrote about in his piece, and just to get a bit of a sense of the history of fandom, and then there's a couple of clips afterwards that might help to set a little bit of a scene for the lecture.
I just don't enjoy your music.
No.
It's just
No,
not good.
No.
Really, in my opinion.
No.
It's
No.
not like...
No! You're wrong! You're wrong!
'Cause I wanna be like the cool kids. I took a flight for some new kicks. The 1800s is the best, but no racial though.
This just kind of seems like another level of performative victimhood to the point where it just seems ridiculous.
I wish I could be racist, but you can't be racist. So we could be in times where there were people that were racist.
She's high on her own supply. She's drunk her own Kool-Aid. And on top of that, she needs to stop working with Jack Antonoff.
All her songs are in a book. I love to read. I like to read. You hater. Hell.
So it's very rare that I'm like ever scared or nervous to make a video because I usually have a set list of topics that I like to avoid, and Taylor Swift isn't one, but she does have a lot of adjacent ones. For example, I will never ever make a standalone video about Maddie Healy. It will never happen. I will never make a standalone Kanye video. And I also in general don't like to attract large amounts of unhinged stans who have never been here before and don't know me and my whole shtick. However, as someone who does consider themselves to be a Swiftie in the most casual sense, I do have some opinions on her newest album, The Tortured Poets Department. If you are a part of my Patreon, you've probably seen my initial reaction to it.
So we get this sense from maybe the pop culture response or the satirical or the editorial video essayist type approach, cultural critic point of view that fans are all sorts of things, right? They're very passionate, they're very protective, they can be quite opinionated, they might be hyperfixated. We get this sense of them not really fitting in anywhere else apart from their community, and even sometimes within that community there's a lot of gatekeeping or hierarchies that fans find they have to deal with. Volatile, fanatic to the point of sort of isolation or mania, and also these sort of perhaps more unfair words like brainless, volatile, just sort of slavishly following the object of their interest. And these are words that still fly around if you read a lot of cultural commentary about fans and fandoms today. It's very, very common to encounter words like these. Jenkins, for instance, says that fans are often characterised as kooks, which is not a word you hear very much of nowadays, but obsessed with trivia, celebrities and collectibles, as misfits and crazies, as a lot of overweight women, a lot of divorced and single women, as childish adults, in short, as people who have little or no life apart from their fascination with this particular program. Jenkins talking here about a lot of characterizations that, to be fair, he's criticising and were dated and seen as pejorative even in his day. So even though it says 2013 here, the original version of Textual Poachers, the book that this quote's from, is from much earlier. So yeah, it's a criticism here of stay-at-home, predominantly mothers, women, wives, who supposedly get obsessed with soap operas or with other TV programs. Perhaps now the stereotype might be into reality TV or etc., Hallmark films or whatever that happens to be. Absolutely no shade whatsoever on a good Hallmark film. I just want to make that point very, very clear. But yeah, Jenkins kind of rushes into the defense of fans here, where he says that fan culture stands as an open challenge to the naturalness and desirability of dominant cultural hierarchies, a refusal of authorial authority and a violation of intellectual property, which is a bit harsh, but I suppose what he's saying here is that when it comes to fans, a lot of the time they sort of break the rules when it comes to things like copyright, and they don't really care that you can't be a fan of, for instance, an alleged murderer or an alleged predator or an alleged, insert whatever here. And that's why I've got these examples here on the right-hand side where it's like you've got a lot of problematic people who still have these large and devoted followings, and the existence of those followings just sort of breaks the rules of all sorts of things around how culture should operate. So fans and fandoms in this way are a really fascinating phenomenon to observe from a kind of media and cultural studies point of view. Obviously there's a huge history. As I said, it sort of emerged in kind of the mid-20th century with primarily the Beatles were a huge part of this, but also Elvis Presley, Marilyn Monroe, older sort of golden age Hollywood film stars certainly had, I'm sure they had fans, right? But the practice of fandom was quite private, or it was sort of contained to friendship groups rather than this crowd of, like it says here, devotees. So yeah, this idea of a fanatic that would come out, that would sort of break all the rules of accepted behavior in public or as part of a society at that time. I mean, obviously it's much more acceptable and completely acceptable now to go and cheer on a sports team or go and just have a great time at a concert, for example. But at this time, this was bizarre behavior. So these people, so for example, Beatlemania, fans of the Beatles would make their own badges, you can see here. They would take heaps of photos themselves. They would make banners. They would make their own clothing and all that sort of stuff. This was kind of new behavior, at least at this scale, right? And you can start to see where commentary at the time, because, I'm certain there's, I think, I can see one man in the crowd there, and I'm certain that at the time there were a lot of male Beatles fans, but these images predominantly ended up being of women. So the commentary at the time was that these were sort of brainless, feminized, desexualized, infantile, emotionally stunted, intellectually stunted people that where knowledge and critical thinking would go in their brain. They've just filled it with these men, they're sort of ravenous fans. It's completely bonkers, this kind of commentary, but this is how people reacted to seeing these kinds of responses to popular artists or TV shows or films or whatever it happened to be. And at this time, again, like I said, you can see the cameras, you can see that people are starting to have a little bit of ownership and control over media making, even if it's just making a banner, right? So there's always been this kind of connection, I suppose, between technology and media and fandom, the ability to make stuff yourself that kind of expresses your fandom, has always been a really important part of being a practicing fan, if that makes sense. And we can start to see, I suppose, how technology, as we move into, say, the social media age, really amplifies this kind of behavior around celebrities. So fandoms and people that are starting to try and understand fans and fan behaviors, they start to observe, and rightly so, that people start to take their fandom incredibly seriously and incredibly personally. It becomes a part of their daily life, it becomes part of how they express and understand themselves, and it becomes part of their identity, like a core part of their identity and who they are. So there's this idea of remediating images, characters, concepts that are part of that fan object. So be it a television show, be it an image of George Harrison or Ringo Starr, be it clips from songs or clips from video or film. They borrow, for perhaps want of a better word. They take, and this is where those ideas of IP and copyright are really sort of fluid in this space, but they take these images and characters and they inflect them. So they add their own spin, right? They make it their own. They sort of remix, if you like, remediate popular culture. They find friends who have the same interest, right? It builds this idea of a collective identity. It builds a support network. It builds this feeling of belonging and community that maybe they wouldn't have access to in any other way. And yeah, this is this shift from just a taste or something you enjoy to really a passion and to really it becoming a core part of who you are. And particularly, even though, for terrible reasons, women in the 50s and 60s were singled out as kind of the target of a lot of pejorative ideas around fandom, there is a sense of empowerment and, like I said, community and belonging that comes from being part of this group. So in many ways they were challenging accepted behaviour or expected behaviour from women at the time. They were supposed to be quiet, withdrawn, passive. They weren't meant to be out in the street or, you know, just shouting and screaming and being very passionate about something. This was dangerous. You know, this was something that threatened the established and accepted order of the time. And fandoms have a real history and a real knack for, you know, either confirming, but particularly for challenging, reinscribing accepted norms. So whether that's gender presentation, what you're supposed to desire sexually, what you're supposed to dress in, what you're supposed to wear, what you're supposed to listen to, how you're meant to present, you know, like I said, from a gender perspective, but also from a race perspective, just from a human being, individual identity perspective, whatever makes you who you are. Fandoms and being part of that fan community can often allow you to maybe blur or break down some of those expected behaviours or practices. And I guess part of it becoming part of your identity is that you really start to identify on a personal level with the people that are the object of your fandom. Or the object of your kind of enjoyment or following or whatever that happens to be. In the broadcast era, so, you know, pre-internet, pre-social media, this was very much a one-way relationship, or it was kind of, it was parasocial relationships were very much felt, I'm sure. And you can sort of see that on a lot of the emotions that are being expressed in some of those older images. But it was very much a one-way relationship. The idea of public relations for celebrities was very much confined to, for example, a record label or a film studio or a talent agency or talent management. And it was very, very tightly controlled. There was no acknowledgement necessarily from the celebrity themselves or from their teams that it was anything other than just, we really appreciate the fans coming out, we appreciate their enthusiasm, all of that sort of stuff. And other than that, it was kind of maybe just it happens on stage, right? Or it happens at a premiere where you kind of get out of the car and you wave, and that's kind of it. Right, that's all the acknowledgement there is. That changed a little bit maybe in the 80s and 90s, where people might sort of stop to sign things, or and you know, maybe if you had a camera you might do whatever the 80s or 90s equivalent of a selfie was, right? But it was still very much that celebrity, the object of the fandom, had their hands very much off, you know. They weren't engaged in any kind of meaningful way with their fans. An exception to that is this weird thing called a fan club, which I think still happens in some form nowadays, but it's probably primarily online. But back in the day, there were these sanctioned clubs, or unsanctioned. Sometimes they were unauthorized, unofficial, where you would maybe send in $10 or something, either by check, or sometimes you would just literally send cash in the post, and you might get a newsletter mailed out to you every month or every other month or something. Maybe you'd get some official photographs or you know, photostated, autographed photos that would be sent out to you. But in general, like I said, very one way, very controlled. The internet obviously changed all this. Not in the sense that I suppose you immediately had this very real relationship with your with the thing that you're, or the person that you're very passionate about and following very closely, But social media and the internet gave this illusion of two-way interaction. And a lot of celebrities kind of bought into this, and they, really grabbed with both hands the opportunity to kind of give an unfiltered view of themselves and their lives and, what they supposedly get up to day, even if it's a highly curated version of that. But it really led to this fantastic and terrible combination of heightened emotional investment, money, and a real sense of entitlement that fans believed that they had the right to sort of comment on, give advice, to respond in whatever extreme or not so extreme way they wanted to what the celebrity got up to in their social life. For instance, social life or romantic life or whatever it happened to be, business decisions that the person might be making. And I feel like in the last couple of years, this idea has really come to a head with mega celebrities like Taylor Swift, for example, and just the omnipresence of Swift during her recently ended Eras tour, for example, which obviously was an enormous undertaking and had an enormous duration, and I feel like it really kept Swift in the spotlight and at the front of people's minds and at the top of the headlines and trending all over social media for the extent of that period of time. And I mean, she intelligently kind of fueled that in certain ways and made the most of it in terms of releasing new material and all of that sort of thing. But there was also backlash in terms of her supposedly private life. I use that word private incredibly loosely, but it also sort of gave people this sense that they had the right to comment on literally everything that she did from day to day. And it was all over social media. And I'm sure for fans of Swift, if there are any Swifties out there, this is something that you woke up with, went to sleep with, tracked all through the day, all of that sort of stuff. And I think tracking things and keeping abreast of what people are saying, there's no issue with that at all. What I think is potentially when it gets a little bit dangerous is when people start to feel like they have that exclusive access. They feel like they can tell this person what to do, and they feel like they can just put out there any reaction without any kind of filter or editing or critical thought or patience, for example. And we've seen celebrities themselves grapple with this. I mean, Swift's released a couple of documentaries and a few statements over the years talking about her relationship with her fans in generally positive terms, but also sometimes critically. And in 2023 and forward from then, Phoebe Bridgers has been very vocal about just the insane behaviour that people think they can get up to hiding behind a keyboard. And I suppose one other side effect that I've been really interested in and just observed with this sort of social media fandom, parasocial relationship, perfect storm, is this idea of people thinking or believing that what they see on stage or on film or on TV is the complete truth. There is sometimes with certain media pieces, this reaction comes out where the critic or the fan or just the observer, whoever it happens to be, is just 100% believing that this is all real, that there's no artifice, that there's no performance aspect to it. And I got that sense with, firstly, the 1975 tour a couple of years ago, when they'd released their new album, and they did the tour, and they did a huge show at Madison Square Garden, and there's this sort of, they run through the album, and there's this moment at the end of the show where the frontman, Matty Healy, just goes on a bit of a mindfuck bender thing and just eats a steak on stage and touches himself and all that sort of stuff. And the response to that was so insane in terms of people like asking if he's okay, right? Are you all right? Are you all right? They're completely ignoring the fact that, like, you know, they go and clean themselves up and then come back 10 minutes later and then just do like a set of their hits. Completely fine. And they did this over and over again. It's a tour, right? And a similar reaction for those that have seen Bo Burnham's Inside, which I just think is a stunning piece of performance art, of kind of auto-documentary in a way, personal, reflexive, poetic film, incredible musically, obviously, but also as a kind of time capsule of, I guess, where everyone was in 2020 and 2021. A lot of responses to that thought they were kind of seeing this person break down live, that there was no filter from Burnham's point of view, right? That there was no art or artifice involved, that this wasn't so much an expression of the feelings that he was feeling, but rather the experience of those feelings specifically happening live on camera. And a lot of the commentary that came out around it, again, was like, is Bo okay? What's going on? Like, and the response from Burnham himself was like, well, obviously I wasn't okay. Like, a lot of people weren't okay. I was dealing with a lot of stuff. But the way that I was processing that was by writing these songs. And like, a lot of the film that you see on Inside is sometimes him writing the stuff live, but other times he re-performed it to make sure it looked good, right? Some of it is messy because he wanted to leave that in. But there's this idea of critical distance that I feel, social media in particular, but also perhaps this constant connectivity that we have, can really let people believe a lot of things and take a lot of things at face value rather than taking a step back, for instance. And I think Swift is a perfect case study for this. The fans really do feel like they know her in terms of tearing apart the lyrics, trying to understand what's going through her head and decoding gestures on stage at different shows depending on who's in the audience and that sort of thing. There is that fantastic sense of connection that she encourages, but there is also a dark side to that kind of enthusiasm where there is that real sense of entitlement and false connection. But moving on. So the reading from Jenkins was from a book called Textual Poachers, which is remains a great title after all of these years. And for Jenkins, he says that fans are nomadic readers, so they'll often consume complete texts, be that, a series of books or a series of films, multiple seasons of a TV show, all the albums from a particular artist, but they will also tend to jump around and grab bits, either quotes that they like or little moments that they want to capture. It's part of that sort of borrowing and inflecting that I was talking about before. On the one hand, it's a fantastic way of making a particular cultural object feel like your own and curating your own unique take on that body of work. Potentially, there is a danger there as well, again, just on the flip side of taking things out of context and not really understanding, like I was talking about just then, this idea of artifice, art, people making stuff up. You know, people make stuff up for art all the time. Not every film or song or book is autobiographical. But yeah, the fans are nomadic by nature, and they kind of grab different parts of it and bring it together. And in that way, there is real possibility and potential for cross-platform engagement from fans. So there's a real willingness to jump across or beyond the original form into different formats. So whether that comes from the object of the fandom themselves, or whether that comes from fans as fan practice and performance and behaviour, differs. Like I said, there's clubs, there's groups, there might be live experiences and conventions. This is all the different parts of fan behaviour and fan practices can take all sorts of different forms, is basically what this is about here. And social media is a huge driver for this, from, you know, reaction videos, supercuts, hashtag campaigns, which I can't really believe are still a thing, but occasionally you see one pop up. And of course, wild conspiracy theories. Look, they're not all wild conspiracy theories. Sometimes they're just fan theories that are all in good faith and good fun, but occasionally they will get very, very unhinged and unbelievable. In terms of cultural output and production from fans, and this is something that, again, happens organically and through kind of a critical mass of people coming together. You will get live experiences, you will get conventions. This might be driven by the celebrity or by the object of fandom, but oftentimes people will just set it up themselves. It's a way of getting together and sharing passion for something. Fanzines are remarkably still a thing. Physical media is back, I guess, which is amazing. Like, look behind me here. Art auctions, edits and memes circulate wildly. Original fan content, fan fiction remains a huge part of fan culture. And cosplay, obviously cosplay, for depending on what the product or piece of culture is. You know, if they've got amazing costumes, then people will 100% make their own versions of those costumes and wear them around and about, particularly at a good con. So with all of that in mind, where do we start unpacking fandoms, I guess, to begin with, but particularly a fandom that we're a part of? It can be quite difficult, I think, to sort of step outside yourself and look back at the ways that you've engaged with something, particularly if it's been a lifelong or a long-term engagement with something. So I am 100% a Star Wars nerd and have been my whole life, I suppose. I think I first saw A New Hope, or Star Wars, if you like. I was probably 7 or 8, so I suppose it's ever since then, right? And I've been varying levels of active and passionate in my fandom, right? In terms of when I was a kid, of course, I had a lot of toys and posters on the wall and all of that sort of stuff. But as I've grown older, I still adore those films, right? But there aren't any posters on my wall right now. Looking around, you know, I will watch Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. Look, I'll even watch the prequels. I'm not necessarily a prequel hater. I have some feelings about all the films, right? But my fan practice, my fan engagement has changed and evolved and matured, I suppose, with me. But, you know, I still love a good fan theory, still love a good meme. I still proudly call myself a fan of that franchise, because it's been a huge part of my life, and has, you know, cheered me up and has given me friends and all that sort of stuff. So for me, it is incredibly tough to observe that trajectory over those years, if that makes sense. But autoethnography is really designed to help you ask questions that will kind of allow you to trace your engagement. So, excuse me for 1 second, I'll just have a drink here. So from a, I suppose, definitional point of view, autoethnography is a method that allows it allows the scholar or the researcher to study culture from the perspective of the self. So it allows, where other methods perhaps wouldn't necessarily allow you to reflect on personal experience or to connect your experience to cultural analysis or to observations or things like that. Autoethnography really does permit these kinds of observations and these kinds of reflections. These kinds of ways of working. But within parameters, and I think it is really important that those parameters exist. But yeah, these are the main, I guess, methods. So reflect, like I have obviously on my fandom, look back over time and find, for example, photographs or old drawings or old pieces of writing that you've done, as well as observations from maybe your friendship group if you share a fandom with your friends. Observations of how other people practice their fandom. Is it similar to yours, or is it different? Is it something that you do collectively together? Do you build this fandom together? And really reflect on your personal experience. So things like feelings are okay when it comes to autoethnography. But again, as a method that you gather all of this data that can be quite personal and can be potentially quite emotional, right? But that isn't necessarily what you produce, if that makes sense. It's the raw data from which you start to do your own analysis, start to synthesize some ideas, grab some research, some ideas from other people and plug that in and combine it to create something that is autoethnographic method-wise, but in terms of a product it might be something slightly different. In terms of those parameters, so like I said, the raw data is going to be quite personal if it's your own fandom, because you're looking at your position as a fan of something. So the idea is to start wherever you are. What does your fandom look like now? Is it like me, like mine, perhaps something that was very core to your identity, at the risk of being bullied perhaps like I was a little bit for being a giant nerd, or is it something a little bit more mainstream where it allowed you maybe to feel accepted as part of a larger group, or is it something else entirely? And how has that changed? Where are you now as opposed to where you were a year, 5 years, 10 years ago with your fandom, if it lasts that long? Or is it a new fandom? Is it something that you've only recently become passionate about? Are you in that kind of everything's new and exciting, I still have things to explore and discover type phase? Wherever you are, jot down those ideas, right? Where do you feel like you are in the fandom? And then from there you might combine that with some of those other pieces of raw data. So old photos or old pieces of writing, or reflections on what it used to feel like to be a fan of something. Has that thing gone out of favor maybe perhaps, and you feel a little bit more like an outlier now? Or has it come into vogue? Are you part of the cool kids now, right? That's sometimes what it felt like, for example, with Star Wars, when it became a huge thing and suddenly nerds were cool. It was a weird time to be a long-term Star Wars fan, because suddenly you're in the mainstream, you weren't an outlier, and that can lead to mixed feelings, right? So gather all the raw data about where you have been and where you are, and then this is when you start to practice some critical distance. You start to maybe critique some of the behaviors, not critique as in criticize or tear down, right? But just observing patterns and critiquing them as an outsider might, just sort of going, oh, okay, so my fan practice evolved over the years from something that was a lot more active into something that's maybe a bit more passive. I was a producer of materials, or I shifted to become a producer of materials rather than just a consumer. There was a point maybe where it was a lot more social and I was participating in the social aspects of it a little bit more, as opposed to now or previously. But yeah, you start to use your personal experience then as an analytical lens, and recollections, memories, images and feelings, like I said, are very much the raw data. You might start from your own position, but then allow anecdotes or your own experience to maybe set up something that you might say about that fandom. You know, is your own experience of a fandom a good example of fandom, or is it maybe a bit of a strange take on that fandom? It's always interesting to consider these things. And then in terms of method and what you might do beyond that, you might want to do things like go to some kind of gathering of fans. You might want to do some... No, I'm not saying you might want to. You definitely must do online and library research for popular takes, commentary, articles, academic work in particular about fans in general, but if there is any specific academic work about your fandom, then you definitely want to plug into that. This idea of collaborative witnessing, so gathering a group of fans together to sit down and consume something or go to an event or whatever, and really have it be an active... it might feel a bit artificial, but it's like, you know, setting up this thing where you can really observe fandom in practice. It might be interviews, it might be looking at posts on social media, or it might be finding some creative work that you might want to include. For those last few, as well as for collaborative witnessing, you will need a release form, some kind of permission for that. But we can go through that if you feel like that's something that you want to explore. There are some challenges of fandom, and this photo is taken in sort of the back room of the Vine Coffee Roasters, which is on the ground floor of Building 80. There is a giant painting of Bill Murray in that cafe, and look, I think on the spectrum, Bill Murray isn't mega problematic necessarily. I think he's potentially just a little bit kind of creepy, maybe. But again, there's conflicting reports, right? But I thought it was... I hadn't realised necessarily that this is where I was working on these lecture slides. So I just took this photo because, for me, I mean, Bill Murray is in a lot of movies that I really love, and another fandom that I suppose I have been a part of for a long time is Wes Anderson, and this guy happens to be in a lot, if not most, Wes Anderson movies. So I just thought it was interesting, in light of this slide, that I happen to be sitting there, because fandoms change, they are dynamic. People change, and people do stuff, they make choices, right? For better or worse. And sometimes those choices kind of happen live in the moment while you're being a fan of them, and other times things come to light, right? And this is something that we've seen happen over and over and over again over the last several years, and it happens all the time, where a story will come out, someone will come out with a horrible tale of something that someone who otherwise maybe is beloved or has a large following, and there's shock and disbelief and all of that sort of stuff. But for better or worse, the objects of fandoms tend to be human beings, and human beings make mistakes and they are fallible. So we have to be aware of this as researchers. Obviously we are as fans, right? But creators are living, evolving human beings. I'll link a blog post that was made by an author called John Scalzi, who's a science fiction author. He made a post in response to a lot of reactions that people were having to the recent quite shocking allegations about Neil Gaiman. And there was a lot of response to those shocking stories that said, thank God we've got John Scalzi, right? We don't need Neil Gaiman because we've got John Scalzi. And the idea behind that was that, thank God we have this completely unproblematic person to fall back on now that Neil Gaiman's cancelled, right? And this post was fantastic because it basically said, all right, maybe I haven't done things that are, potentially criminal or, that violate people in such a way. However, this idea that I'm, to be held up as this ideal of male science fiction author behavior is completely and utterly absurd. And he had this quite thoughtful post about, like, he wasn't trying to tear himself down too much, but it was this idea of we're all just human beings and we're all just doing our best. And, I try to be a good husband and person and ally and all that sort of stuff, but I make mistakes and I'm imperfect just like everyone. Which was this really good kind of reality check, I think, for a lot of fans and people who were trying to grapple, I suppose, with what do you do if, like, behind me down there you've got Sandman or Neverwhere or whatever it happens to be, in the same way as, how many... My partner and I have Harry Potter, right? We've got the films, we've got the books. It's still on the shelf. It's kind of like, what do you do with all of that material? And these are things that you have to deal with as a human being, as a fan, but also as a researcher. So I think just being aware of and acknowledging some of that as part of reality, first of all, but also as part of your fan journey is kind of how you try and process some of this from an academic and scholarly perspective, which may help you sort of process it as a fan and as a person yourself. So just some questions in that vein. How do we acknowledge our changing relationship with text over time? Can we use personal discomfort as a kind of tool, as a kind of lens, a way of looking at these materials or ourselves? How do we balance emotional investment with that kind of critical judgment and critical analysis? And what happens when our identity as a fan conflicts with other parts of our identity? Whether that's a question for yourself or just for general consideration. I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. Please discuss all these in class. Class absolutely must feel like a safe space where you can talk about all sorts of things, within reason, obviously, but in terms of fandoms and personal investment, I hope you feel comfortable enough to really break down some of these ideas and these questions in the discussion. So Jenkins has this fantastic quote about fandom as a permanent culture. Media fandom gives every sign of becoming a permanent culture, one which has survived and evolved for more than 25 years. I think it's safe to say that he nailed it with this one. I think media fandom will be around for quite some time yet. I think it's got real staying power. and there's plenty to think about and to talk about when it comes to fans and fandoms. So with that in mind, if you haven't already, definitely this week in class you'll get into assignment 1. You'll figure out which fandom you want to explore yourselves. A lot of the week 2 activities, or some of them, were designed to get you thinking about this, and really just get stuck into the assignment work. Maybe use this time to try and get into some research, while you've got the uni Wi-Fi available, but also while you've got access to your tutor to try and sort of help you what to search for, how to find journal articles and use them, and how to access books online, what to do with the physical library, etc., etc. In week 4, we're going to look at what modern media consumption looks like from kind of a measurement point of view, but like how on earth you unpack audience behaviors from whatever this is, our modern media world, right? And then in week 5 we get into part 1 of transmedia storytelling, and that shift into assignment 2. If there are any questions, obviously reach out to your tutors. Otherwise, I hope you have a fantastic week, and I will see you soon. Bye.